So welcome to the American Bar Association webinar, U.S. Elections 2020, Where and How Do We Draw a Constitutionally Permissible Line to a Candidate's Inflammatory Political Rhetoric? My name is Angie Abdelkader, and I'll be acting as the program's moderator. Today's webinar is hosted by the Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, and it's sponsored by the Rights of Immigrants Committee. It's part of a 6-part national lecture series with a new program on the third Wednesday of every month. We're excited to have a number of other important co-sponsors, including the ABA Commission on Immigration, the ABA Criminal Justice Section, the ABA Center for Public Interest Law, the ABA Section of International Law, as well as the ABA Government and Public Section Lawyers Division. We appreciate all of your support. It is also important to highlight that none of this would be possible without the technical and logistical support of ABA staff. Thank you, Paula Shapiro and Ali Kilsberg, for all your work to make this program a success. I'm humbled to have our esteemed panelists join us today. But before we begin, it's important that I lay the substantive groundwork as the moderator. As many of you are aware, political candidates running for public office have long exploited popular fears, racial anxieties, and other divisions as an electoral strategy. Increasingly, and most recently, this has led to socially oppressed group claims that some political rhetoric is so inflammatory that it impermissibly inspires violence against community members. According to the most recent FBI hate crime statistics report, the amount of hate crimes involving physical violence, including intimidation, assault, and homicide, has reached a 16-year high. And many of the impacted minority groups, including Latinos, Blacks, Jews, and Muslims, attribute this increased violence to Donald J. Trump's inflammatory political rhetoric and discriminatory policies. It's important to note that scholars have long observed that political discourse and political events can contribute to the frequency of bias incidents. In fact, this phenomenon has a name today. It's called the Trump effect. Since he first launched his presidential campaign in 2015, Trump's rhetoric was racially charged. Upon announcing his run, for instance, then candidate Trump described Mexican immigrants as rapists, bringing drugs and crime into the U.S. He claimed, "They're sending us not the right people. The U.S. has become a dumping ground for everyone else's problems." During the speech, Trump also announced his plans for a border wall, claiming that he would make Mexico pay for it. Shortly after those remarks, 2 brothers attacked a homeless Latino man in Boston, Massachusetts. One of the attackers stated that he was inspired by Mr. Trump's immigration rhetoric. Once in the Oval Office, Trump's divisive rhetoric and politics that contributed to the dehumanization and debasement of Latino immigrants continued unapologetically. He shut down the government for 35 days to secure funding for a wall on the U.S.-Mexican border. He sent 3 times as many workers to help victims of Hurricane Harvey in Houston as compared to those of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. He approved 23 times as much money for individual assistance for Harvey's victims. Further, Trump has used the word quote-unquote animal many times to describe those crossing the border and immigrants accused of crimes such as gang members. During a discussion about MS-13, for example, Trump said, quote, "We have people coming into the country or trying to come in, and we're stopping a lot of them. But we're taking people out of the country. You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. They aren't people, they're animals. And we're taking them out of the country at a level and at a rate that's never happened before." Critics responded that no one deserves to be likened to quote-unquote animals, no matter their offense. Moreover, during immigration talks with lawmakers in the Oval Office, President Trump used an offensive and inappropriate description of Haiti, El Salvador, and African countries, asking, quote, "Why are we having all these people from shithole countries," excuse my language, "come here?" Trump then expressed a preference for increased immigration from European countries like Norway. To be sure, Trump's xenophobic rhetoric, including calling Latino immigrants quote-unquote invaders who are quote infesting our country, continues to embolden perpetrators of hate crimes. And what has emerged as a broad national trend, his supporters often explicitly reference Trump during attacks. For instance, in a 2017 attack against an undocumented immigrant in Michigan, 2 male assailants stapled a note to the victim's stomach that stated, quote, "Trump doesn't like you." In a distinct incident last year, a Latino man and his mother, who were doing yard work in California, were verbally attacked by a woman who called them illegals and rapists. When a man confronted the woman after hearing her yell, "Go back to Mexico," to his mother, she said, "You're all illegal, go back to Mexico." When he responded, "Why do you hate us?" she responded, "Because you're Mexicans." When the victim, who happens to be a US citizen, explained, "We're honest people right here," the woman retorted, "Yeah, rapist. Even a president of the United States says you're a rapist." And as Trump embarks on his 2020 re-election campaign amid charges of impeachment, he continues to play on popular fears, racial anxieties, and other divisions. Just a few months ago, President Trump asked an audience at a rally how they would stop migrants from attempting to enter this country. When a supporter responded, "Shoot them," the president grinned, nodded, and failed to offer any appropriate corrective. For many in the Latinx community, the El Paso mass shooting targeting Mexicans on August 3rd was a natural progression from inflammatory speech by national leaders to xenophobic violence. Mimicking the president's language, the shooter wrote in his manifesto posted online that El Paso was, quote, "in response to the Hispanic invasion of Texas," unquote. On Facebook alone, Trump's campaign is responsible for more than 2,000 ads in the last year that reference a quote-unquote invasion when referring to immigrants on the southern border. More recently, a 61-year-old white Milwaukee man attacked his Latino victim with acid while saying, "Why did you invade my country? And why don't you respect my laws?" The victim, who happens to be a US citizen, sustained second-degree burns on his neck and third-degree burns on his face. Such attacks are part of a much broader pattern of hateful violence. In fact, hate crimes against the Latino community have surged more than 40% since the 2016 US presidential election cycle. And Latino advocacy groups are blaming the vitriol coming from President Trump and the right wing of the Republican Party. As noted, Latinos are not alone in their sentiment. The NAACP, for instance, has attributed the continued rise in anti-Black hate crimes to Trump's political rhetoric and racist policies. Trump's invective has focused on Black athletes, lawmakers, countries, and communities. The NAACP believes that such divisive and hateful language has manifested in racist acts against people of color. In fact, according to the most recent FBI hate crime statistics report, African Americans remain the most targeted group. While they comprise only 13% of the total US population, anti-Black hate crimes make up approximately 60% of all such crimes, speaking to the grossly disproportionate levels of violence that minority community experiences. Similar to the Latino and Black compatriots, Jewish and Muslim Americans have also voiced similar concerns. In August of 2017, hundreds of white supremacists marched onto the University of Virginia's campus in Charlottesville as part of the Unite the Right rally. They chanted, "Jews will not replace us." Counter-protests confronted rally participants who were responding to the proposed removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Ultimately, a white supremacist drove his vehicle into those counter-protesters, killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer and injuring 35 others. President Trump responded to the turmoil by condemning, quote, "this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides." He then paused and repeated, "on many sides." After controversy ensued regarding his remarks, Trump revisited his initial statement and specifically condemned the KKK, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other hate groups. But then, a day later, he clarified that they were, quote, "very fine people on both sides," while adding that the alt-left had been, quote, "very, very violent." In addition to the anti-Semitic rantings in Charlottesville, Jewish Americans have witnessed a number of tragic attacks against synagogues. Last year, for instance, in what is regarded as the worst anti-Semitic attack on US soil, a shooter espousing white nationalist ideology killed 11 worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Prior to the shootings, the attacker posted online about a Jewish nonprofit, HIAS, assisting immigrant invaders. Like their Latino and African American counterparts, Jewish organizations have also blamed Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric and the emboldening of the far right as part of what is contributing to anti-Semitic incidents. According to the most recent FBI hate crime statistics report, anti-Semitic hate crimes account for nearly 60% of all such religiously motivated crimes. Notably, Jews comprise a mere 2 to 3% of the total US population. They too are experiencing disproportionate levels of violence. According to Rabbi Jill Jacobs, quote, "through his rhetoric, the president, his advisors, and many of his supporters are fanning the flames of this hatred. Their rhetoric and dog whistles have resulted in neo-Nazis feeling empowered to march in the streets, mosques and synagogues being regularly targeted for vandalism and violent threats, and people who don't fit the white nationalist and Christian profile being attacked on the streets." Muslims are well aware of the Trump effect as well. In fact, during the 2016 US presidential election cycle, they were the canaries in the coal mine, complaining that the inflammatory political rhetoric coming from the Republican Party was causing violence against their community. According to academic research, Muslim Americans were 3 to 5 times more likely to be victims of threats or acts of violence during the 2016 US presidential elections, when political invective frequently cast them as terrorists, religious extremists, and undesirable refugees. The Trump campaign was particularly xenophobic. During the 2015 campaign rally, Trump nodded along as a supporter claimed, quote, "We have a problem in this country. It's called Muslims." Trump nodded, saying, "Right, we need this question." When a supporter asked, "When can we get rid of them Muslims?" Trump said, "We're going to be looking at a lot of different things." In addition to calling for warrantless surveillance of mosques, a Muslim registry or database, and in the notorious Muslim ban, Trump also falsely claimed that, quote, "Islam hates us." In the Oval Office, President Trump immediately signed executive orders banning immigrants from 7 Muslim-majority countries, making good on a campaign promise calling for a total and complete shutdown on Muslims entering the US. As he signed the order, he insisted he was keeping the, quote, "Islamic radicals out," even though no one from the enumerated countries has ever killed anyone here. Such policies and rhetoric has created fertile soil for anti-Muslim violence. Indeed, shortly after ascending to the US presidency, a white businessman assaulted a Muslim American woman in a hijab in New York while stating, quote, "Trump is here now and he will get rid of all of you." Muslim advocacy groups claimed that anti-Muslim hate crimes surged immediately following the implementation of the Muslim ban. What is more, according to a 2018 report from South Asian Americans Leading Together, 1 in 5 perpetrators of hate violence incidents against the Massa community have cited President Trump, a Trump policy, or a Trump campaign slogan. Both as a candidate and now as president, Trump continues to inspire anti-Muslim hatred and violence. According to the most recent FBI hate crime statistics report, Muslim Americans are also living disproportionate levels of violence. Beyond these group claims, journalists have also complained that hateful speech demonizing them has incited physical assaults and threats. In fact, according to Gallup, 58% of Americans now blame recent mass shootings on inflammatory political rhetoric by prominent politicians or political commentators. The Asian Research Institute has made similar findings. But this isn't just a matter of public perception. A number of academics have published research that bolsters such claims. For instance, American researchers from the University of Alabama and Loyola Chicago confirmed that the 2016 US presidential election and Trump's ultimate ascension to the Oval Office was associated with a statistically significant surge in reported hate crimes across the country. Another team of researchers from the University of North Texas found that counties that hosted a 2016 Trump campaign rally saw a 226% increase in reported hate incidents over those that did not. What is more, counties that voted for President Trump experienced the largest increases in reported hate crimes. Notably, the United States experienced no similar spike in hate crimes in the wake of the elections of Presidents William Clinton, George W. Bush, or Barack Obama. The academic research confirms that the Trump effect is around 33 times larger than the effect on hate crimes after terror attacks such as those in Orlando, Florida, or San Bernardino, California. In fact, the Trump effect is so statistically significant to hate crimes that it is rivaled by few other events in modern American history, with the exception of September 11th. As you know, First Amendment doctrines provide robust protections for free expression principles. More speech is the preferred response to negative speech. Ultimately, the most truthful, meritorious claims should prevail in a proverbial marketplace of ideas. In Whitney versus California, Justice Louis Brandeis famously explained counterspeech, quote, "If there be a time to expose through discussion the falsehoods and the fallacies, to avert the evil by the processes of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence." But the current socio-political context forces some difficult questions. How does the counterspeech doctrine translate in the lives of socially oppressed groups who lack access to resources in the marketplace of ideas? For instance, is it reasonable to expect a financially strapped family scrapping to survive to effectively counter odious speech by a multimillionaire demonizing their religious, racial, or ethnic identity? What, if any, role do news media outlets play in facilitating the counterspeech doctrine, amplifying marginalized voices, and equalizing the playing field? Should social media technology giants shut down or at minimum temporarily suspend accounts engaging in such noxious rhetoric? Do these candidates jeopardize free speech norms in addition to public safety? Where do we draw the line to hateful political speech in a pluralistic democratic society such as ours that values peaceful coexistence among different racial, ethnic, and religious groups, as well as free expression principles? To help us grapple with these issues and answer some of these questions, we have three esteemed panelists joining us today. And what we're going to do is actually a little different than many past ABA webinars. Typically, we ask our panelists to present their talk for approximately 15, 20, 30 minutes, and then engaging Q&A from the audience. But today we're going to ask you to actually present your questions as you hear each of our panelists engaging with one another. They're going to each present opening remarks for about 5 to 10 minutes. And then after they're done, we're going to have a conversation with one another. I'm going to facilitate that conversation by asking pointed questions based on responses and things that I've prepared to help facilitate our discussion. And as I said, you're welcome to also pose questions. You can do so by using the control panel that should appear on the right-hand side of your screen. Just input your questions, we'll be monitoring them and posing whatever we deem to be appropriate. So our first panelist with us today is Elie Mystal. He joined Above the Law in 2008 by winning the Above the Law Idol contest. Prior to joining them, Elie wrote about politics and popular culture at City Hall News and New York Press. Elie received a degree in government from Harvard University and a JD from Harvard Law School. He was formerly a litigator at a big law firm, but quit the legal profession to pursue a career as an online provocateur. He's written editorials for the New York Daily News and the New York Times, and he has appeared on both MSNBC and Fox News without having to lie about his politics to either news organizations. Welcome, Elie.
Thanks for having me. So I want to start with this simple fact. When horrible political rhetoric happens, when hate speech happens in the political sphere, the people who pay the price for that are Black people, brown people, and Jewish people. All right? Nothing that I can say here today, nothing that I can say on the television, nothing that I can write online is going to make roving bands of Black people stand outside a Cracker Barrel waiting for white people to come out and do them some harm. But nearly anything that Trump says, that the Republican Party says, that people online who are pushing hate speech say, can lead to death and destruction in African American communities, Muslim communities, Latino communities, and Jewish communities. So from the perspective of a person of color, from the perspective of an other, and sorry, I should have also said the LGBT community, because they also feel the brunt of this rhetoric. So from the perspective of an other, when we talk about hate speech, I am not talking about some kind of theoretical issue about First Amendment jurisprudence. I am talking about a literal issue that goes to my safety, the safety of my wife, and the safety of my Black children. Okay? Let's start there. Now, within that milieu of what the problem is, we also have to understand the political desires of the Republican Party. The Republican Party has realized that their policies, generally speaking, are wildly unpopular. All right? People actually don't favor tax cuts for the wealthy. People actually don't favor like endless wild, wild west mass shootings. People don't favor climate change denialism. Republicans have figured out that the only way to get those unpopular policies through is to explicitly tie them to bigotry, misogyny, homophobia, and hate. So it's all so what they are offering the most rabidly violent sections of our society is the hate in exchange for them voting against their own interests on economic and other policies. All right, so that is part of the Republican agenda. That's why we see it in the political sphere. All right, so now what are we supposed to do about it? Look, as you just said in my opening, right? Like, I'm an online gadfly, right? Speech is damn important to me. Without it, I couldn't have a job. And without a real understanding of the limits of government power, this government especially would have me in a gulag if they could. All right, so I understand my entire career is based on the protection of free speech and especially political speech, because without it, I'm toast, right? Without it, this current government would have me on the first train out of here, right? So I understand implicitly how important it is to respect speech. However, and I think, Angie, you set it up exactly right. The so-called solution for hate speech is more speech. That framing and that phraseology was invented by white people to protect white people, right? That phraseology has never worked for African Americans, Latinos, so on and so forth, all right? Because the response that we get for more speech is more FBI files, more assassination attempts, more lynchings. That's what happens to us when we try to inject more speech into the marketplace of ideas. So for me, the solution has to be to change the by whites for whites rhetoric around speech, and simply move the line a little bit further back on a couple of key legal issues. We're talking to a friendly legal audience, so I can get a little bit in the weeds here. There are two main ways to stop hateful political speech. One is incitement. Two is true threat. Those are not protected categories of speech. If you incite people to violence, that's not protected. If you are truly threatening somebody, that's not protected. I don't want to really mess around with true threat because that's I'll leave true threat where it is for now. But incitement to violence, all right? Our current jurisprudence understands incitement to violence needing to be something entirely imminent, right? So like you can be speaking in front of a crowd and say like something should be done about Bob, and that's not incitement to violence, right? If you're speaking in front of a crowd outside of Bob's house and says something should be done about Bob, then maybe you get into the incitement category, right? That's where the line is now. We have to move that line back slightly, right? Because again, I don't want to live in a world where like you can't stop somebody until they start shooting at me, right? Like I want that line moved back to understand that incitement to violence happens a little bit before our current understanding of eminence, right? Incitement to violence can happen at a political rally. Incitement to violence can happen on Twitter. And if we simply understand that, if we simply move the trigger for when the speech becomes unprotected to a point where, as opposed to a reasonable person would understand the speech as an imminent threat to imminent call to lawlessness. If we move that back to the point where we could say a reasonable person would understand that speech as a future call to lawlessness, that would do a lot of the work of allowing us to get at the most awful purveyors of hate speech while still leaving more than enough space for online provocateurs, for people running for president, for a whole host of speech that might be difficult to hear, that might be inflammatory to some, but still kind of safely within what should be protected.
Thank you, Ellie. Really provocative, thought-provoking comments, and I want to definitely give you an opportunity to expand on some of them. But first, let's go on to our next speaker, and then we'll return to you, Ellie. Our next panelist is Wajahat Ali, who's a New York Times contributing op-ed writer, as well as a CNN commentator, TEDx speaker, an award-winning playwright, a recovering attorney, and a former consultant for the US State Department. Ali has given keynote speeches around the world, from TED to the Aspen Ideas Festival to Google to United Nations to New Yorker Festival. His writing appears regularly in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and The Guardian. He helped launch the Al Jazeera America Network as co-host of The Stream, a daily news show that extended the conversation to social media and beyond. He was also a national correspondent, a political reporter, and social media expert for Al Jazeera America. There, he focused on stories of communities and individuals often marginalized or underreported in mainstream media. As a playwright, Ali is the author of Domestic Crusaders, the first major play about Muslim Americans post 9/11, which was published by McSweeney's and performed off-Broadway and at the Kennedy Center. He's a Peabody-nominated producer of the series The Secret Life of Muslims, a series of short-form, first-person documentary films featuring a diverse set of American Muslims. Ali was also the lead author and researcher of, quote, Fear, Inc., Roots of the Islamophobia Network in America, unquote, the seminal report from the Center for American Progress. But perhaps his most noteworthy achievement is being married to a phenomenon Muslim American woman, a physician, Sarah Qureshi, at Georgetown Medical Center, and they've been blessed with 2 beautiful children. So welcome, Wajahat. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Angie. If I wasn't married, that would easily give me at least 3 dates. So I appreciate that amazing introduction. And now I have 3 kids. So we just had a new girl. So that's why I believe it should be very impressive that I don't look like I'm dead. Thank you for inviting a recovering attorney who has not practiced law in about 8 years to join this esteemed panel to discuss the 2020 elections. Of course, that means I'm the ideal person to be giving you attorney's advice. But as a Muslim American, a son of Pakistani immigrants, the last several years, especially during the Trump administration, have been really exciting. My people are really popular with this administration. It's like reading a choose-your-own-adventure book. You kind of don't know what will happen next. I wonder whether or not one day there will be more countries added to the Muslim ban, but it's not a Muslim ban because it's a travel ban, but it's actually a Muslim ban, but you can't call it a Muslim ban. I don't know if Pakistan, my parents' country, will be added to the shithole countries, which apparently he didn't say shithole, he said shithouse, because there's a difference between shithole and shithouse. Apparently shithouse has Wi-Fi. We wonder what new conspiracy theory Donald Trump will tweet out about marginalized people, especially before the elections. Will it be a remake of the tweet he did about General Pershing, who allegedly instructed U.S. soldiers to dip their bullets into pig's blood to kill Muslim terrorists? That is false. He never instructed them to do that. And heads up, I want this to be a very pig-friendly panel. You don't need to dip bullets into pig's blood to kill Muslims. Regular bullets work just fine. We're not like Dracula. There's another conspiracy theory he tweeted, and he still maintains that Muslim Americans celebrated the 9/11 terror attacks. He allegedly saw the video of them celebrating in New Jersey, and no one can find the video. Or he retweets on his own, unannounced, no one asked him to do it, the hate group Britain First, which is a hate group, suggesting that Muslim refugees committed violence. Those are fake videos, and the hate group was so bad that then Prime Minister of UK, Theresa May, had to come out and denounce Britain First. And of course, let's not forget, for the last few months, he has retweeted several times the hate monger Katie Hopkins, British hate monger who has asked for a Muslim solution, has called refugees coming to the UK vermin and cockroaches, and she casually promotes white supremacy. And of course, my favorite, the birther conspiracy. President Obama might or might not be a Muslim who might or might not be born in the United States. And never forget that Melania was a birther, hashtag be best. And I'm really glad Ellie started this conversation by saying there is a violent cost to this political rhetoric. There is a violent cost to these tweets. This is not just intellectual masturbation or political debates or both sides for the rest of us. The rhetoric is borne by the most marginalized of communities, including, but not excluding, not limited to, Muslims, immigrants, Black people, Latinos, LGBTQ, and women. And it's fascinating in 2019 America, for millions of our fellow Americans to feel great again, the rest of us have to suffer. And as Angie mentioned, in 2010, I started doing a report for the Center for American Progress, a think tank. It was published in 2011. That's called Fear Incorporated. You can see it online. And what we did for the first time is we traced about $42 million that was funneled into what we call this nerve center, this very interconnected, incestuous group of think tanks, grassroots groups, activists, religious leaders, politicians, and media outlets that created and promoted what was once considered fringe conspiracy theories, such as Obama is a Muslim, there is a Sharia threat, and on and on and on. That report landed August 2011, coincidentally, right when Anders Breivik, a terrorist in Norway, decided to kill 78 people, blew up a building, and then took a machine gun and mowed down 69, mostly teenagers. And he said that he wanted to punish Europe for its multiculturalism and its pro-immigrant policy. And he warned that these trends would cause the Eurobization of Europe. And in his 1,500-page manifesto, which he left as a training manual for future would-be terrorists, he cites nearly every single individual that I listed in Fear Incorporated. Now, fast forward nearly 10 years, it's 2019, and nearly every single person that we mentioned in Fear Incorporated, the roots of the Islamophobia network, are now either in the White House or one step removed from Trump's White House. I'll repeat this. Nearly every single person that we cited in Fear Incorporated, those same people whose ideology and writings influenced the terrorist Anders Breivik, a man whose writings, Mark Sageman, a counterterrorism expert, said, even though you can't necessarily blame these individuals for, directly causing Anders Breivik, he nonetheless emerges the same, quote, intellectual infrastructure. Those individuals influence Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, Kellyanne Conway. Just let that sink in. There is a violent cost to this rhetoric. And speaking about political rhetoric and the elections, let's take it back. Let's take the DeLorean back to the 2018 midterm elections. President Trump was riding a good economy. The job numbers came out. He decided to double down, nay, triple down on only one talking point: invasion. A caravan of rapists and criminals and terrorists coming from the border, Mexicans and Middle Eastern suspects. Maybe or maybe not, they were funded by George Soros, the Jewish American billionaire. Who knows? But invasion became the talking point that got mainstreamed. It comes from the white supremacist swamp. It literally is a white supremacist conspiracy theory that says that specifically George Soros are a bunch of globalists who have a diabolical plot, a global plot, to use Black people, people of color, immigrants, and Muslims to overrun and take over Europe and bring down Western civilization. Specifically, it is called the replacement theory. That language in November during the midterms was used by Robert Bowers, who decided to invade the enemies at the Tree of Life Synagogue, and he killed 11 people, and he was on the right-wing social media site Gab, and he retweeted a tweet that says, "We have to punish the evil, filthy Jews for bringing in the evil, filthy Muslims," and he wanted to stop the invasion. Fast forward to March, Christchurch, there was a terrorist in New Zealand who attacks 2 mosques on Friday, Jummah prayers, kills more than 50 people, puts on a GoPro headset, and like a Call of Duty video game, live streams it, and he leaves behind a manifesto called The Replacement Theory, voila, where he says that Donald Trump is a renewed symbol of white identity with whom he shares a common purpose. He does not attack Jews or Latinos. He sees the invaders as Muslims. Fast forward to August, El Paso, Texas. There's another terrorist who attacks and kills nearly 24 people at a Walmart. He's inspired by the Christchurch killer. The Christchurch killer was inspired by Anders Breivik. And the El Paso, Texas terrorist leaves behind a 5-page manifesto regurgitating the same rhetoric. In fact, for him, the invaders weren't Muslims, they were Hispanics who were going to replace the workers, replace him, and replace white people. There is a cost to this rhetoric. White supremacist hate groups are now the #1 domestic terror threat, according to the FBI, according to Christopher Wray, who Trump appointed. White supremacist groups and plots are the #1 plots that they have infiltrated and uncovered. According to the FBI, in a Yahoo document that was uncovered, according to a document that was uncovered by Yahoo, FBI is now saying that the popular mainstream right-wing conspiracy theories that are now featured at Trump rallies. QAnon, the deep state conspiracy theory that there's a deep state out to get Trump, is now a domestic terror threat. And they fear, leading up to the 2020 elections, that individuals or groups will be radicalized by this conspiracy theory to commit violence. So there is a cost to free speech. Free speech is not an absolutist right. The First Amendment is being unsheathed by some as a coward's sword, a bigot's refuge. And what happens when the First Amendment is killing the rest of us? If it has been used and abused to launder hate and mainstream conspiracy theories and fear against people of color and to weaken democracy. The irony is that one of the fundamental freedoms of this democracy is being used by some as a Trojan horse to upend it. How do you both sides when one side is an extremist? And another question is, how will we fight back within the limits and expanses of the First Amendment? I know Jim will expand on that. And a quick answer to this, it will take a multicultural coalition of the willing. I will leave it at that because I want to get into the Q&A and I'll expand on this. But I will say, without any hesitation and without any hyperbole, and to give a pop cultural reference, we're taking on Thanos. We're witnessing the death rattle of white supremacy, which has transformed into a death march from here to Europe. And we need a multicultural coalition. We need the Avengers. It will take all of us, lawyers, activists, educators, media personalities, citizens, to combat this threat leading up to 2020, because even if Trump is defeated, Trumpism will last. And we're witnessing, in particular, one political party, I'm sorry to say the Republican Party, that is becoming more radicalized, that is laundering and mainstreaming hate, and it's not going away. And it's a moment of urgency where no one can sit on the sidelines and claim neutrality. And with that, I will give it to Jim, and I look forward to all the questions.
Thank you. Thank you for that impassioned talk. Wajahat. So again, our next speaker is in fact Jim Weinstein, who's our free speech scholar. He is the chair in constitutional law at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law in Arizona, a faculty fellow in the Center for Law, Science, and Innovation at Arizona State University, and an associate fellow with the Center for Public Law at the University of Cambridge. Professor Weinstein's areas of academic interest are constitutional law, especially free speech, as well as jurisprudence and legal history. He is the co-editor of Extreme Speech and Democracy, Oxford University Press, the author of Hate Speech, Pornography, and a Radical Attack on Free Speech Doctrine, and has written numerous articles in Law Review, symposia on a variety of free speech topics, including free speech theory, obscenity doctrine, institutional review boards, commercial speech, database protection, campaign finance reform, the relationship between free speech and constitutional rights, hate crimes, and campus speech codes. Professor Weinstein has litigated several significant free speech cases, primarily on behalf of the Arizona Civil Liberties Union. Earlier in his career, he wrote several influential articles on the history of personal jurisdiction and its implication for modern doctrine. Professor Weinstein also has been a principal speaker at numerous national and international conferences on free speech issues. During law school, he was a member of the University of Pennsylvania Law School Review Board of Officers. After graduating, he served as a law clerk to James R. Browning, Chief Judge of the 9th U.S. Circuit of Appeals, and then practiced civil litigation in Los Angeles for several years before joining the faculty in 1986. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Angie. I have been asked to describe free speech doctrine as a little colorless and boring compared to these very troubling descriptions of some of the violence that has occurred in the last several years. So I was given this task and I will do it. I will describe free speech doctrine. The central feature of First Amendment doctrine is its intense hostility to content regulation. As the Supreme Court of the United States has explained, as a general matter, the First Amendment means that government has no power to restrict expression because of its message, its ideas, its subject matter, or its content. Now, content-based regulations come in different varieties, some worse than others from a First Amendment standpoint. The most egregious form of content discrimination are laws that discriminate on the basis of viewpoint. Now, viewpoint discriminatory laws, to quote the Supreme Court's cumbersome phrase, are laws that are based on the specific motivating ideology or the opinion or perspective of the speaker. An example of a viewpoint-based law would be one that forbade anyone to say abortion is murder, or with particular relevance to this webinar, a law that punishing hate speech, such as then candidate Trump's statement referring to Mexican immigrants as rapists. Viewpoint-based laws do not exhaust the category of content-based regulation. They also would be a ban on a subject matter, so no talking about abortion altogether, either in favor or against it, would also be considered content-based. Now, again, significant to this webinar, the rule against content discrimination extends even beyond laws disfavoring particular viewpoints or subject. It also encompasses bans on highly inflammatory words or symbols. For this reason, an anti-war protester has the right to wear a jacket in public bearing the message, "Fuck the draft," or to burn the American flag, decisions that many on the left really liked. But by the same token, a homophobic preacher has a right to carry a sign in public bearing the virulent hate speech, "God hates fags." So this protection of virulent inflammatory words and symbols allows such speech from all directions. Now, in counter-distinction to content-based laws, there are content-neutral laws, such laws that do not relate to the message of the speech, such as time, place, and manner speech, regulation speech. This would be like you can't use loudspeakers in residential neighborhoods after 10 p.m. It regulates the time, place, or manner, but not the message. Now, while remarkably broad and exceedingly strong, the rule against content regulation is not, has been mentioned, it's not absolute. Rather, the Supreme Court has explained that the First Amendment permits content regulation in a few limited areas, including, from the latest list, obscenity, defamation, fraud, incitement that Ellie mentioned, and speech integral to criminal conduct. Now, I want to emphasize here that there is a peculiar misunderstanding, fortunately not among today's panelists, but among, particularly among college students and also some journalists and some politicians. And that misunderstanding is that hate speech is one of these exceptions. And if something is hate speech, then it can be regulated, but that's not the law. The Supreme Court has never even suggested that hate speech is one of the exceptions, like incitement to the First Amendment. On the contrary, it has on several occasions invalidated hate speech laws. Most recently, in 2017, it unanimously struck down the hate speech provision of a federal trademark law. And in the lead opinion of the case, Justice Alito said, "Speech that demeans on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, age, disability, or any other similar ground is hateful. But the proudest boast of our free speech jurisprudence is that we protect the freedom of thought that we hate." Now, coming back to something that Ellie said, incitement to violence is one of the exceptions that is not protected by the First Amendment. And for that reason, someone who incites racist violence might be constitutionally punished, but not because it's hate speech, but because it's incitement. Now, as Ellie also mentioned, the standard the Supreme Court set for what can be punished as incitement is very, very strict. So they make clear in an opinion called Brandenburg versus Ohio that mere advocacy of violence or crime cannot be punished. So someone has a right in this country to say Hitler was right, Jews should all be exterminated. That is not incitement that would meet the Brandenburg test. Rather, in Brandenburg, the court said that advocacy to be punishable must be, quote, directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and, not or, but and must be likely to produce such action. Such action is imminent lawless action. As Ellie was saying, well, why don't we change this to future action? Now, so this test can be criticized for being too strict. Judge Posner has criticized it. It's open to criticism. I don't think it should go as far as allowing punishment of future advocacy of future violence. And I can, in the question and answer period, to explain that. I think that would be loosen it too much. But there can be reasonable disagreement about whether that test is too strict. Now, as also been mentioned, other liberal democracies allow hate speech bans under their constitutions. And in fact, several countries, including India and Japan, expressly prohibit hate speech in electoral contests. So it can be argued that the Supreme Court was wrong to interpret the First Amendment to prohibit bans on hate speech. I actually think that on balance, our court is right for our country. And I'd be glad to explain why. I've written extensively on it. There's a constitutional commentary in 2017, if you want to look it up. I explain it in detail. I'll give a couple of reasons now. I can't possibly explain all. But first of all, one can doubt how much good a ban on hate speech would do. What is the nexus between that speech and the violence, and that the right thing to do is to punish hate crimes. I've come out in support of hate crime punishment. But also it tends to misfire. Minorities have been particularly targeted by hate speech laws. But one of the biggest problems is defining hate speech in a way that's precise enough for enforcement and practical administration. In Europe, which, as we've mentioned, does have hate speech laws, there's been some real misuse. It's been used to punish speakers for merely referring to homosexuality as immoral, not using any awful epithets or virulent speech, for punishing in an academic seminar someone for saying that the Prophet Muhammad was a pedophile, to jail people for saying that certain ethnic groups are undesirable as guest workers, not even saying things like rapists, just undesirable. And in France, people were punished for advocating the boycotting of purchase of Israeli products. That was considered to be a type of hate speech because it was against a particular ethnic group of Israelis. I think all those, I think, some people would find, I find much of that speech offensive, so do most people. But I think people in a liberal democracy should have a right to say those things. And they were punished under the hate speech laws. Now, I'll end my opening statement by saying that it's clear that under the First Amendment, that the hate speech is protected. You could not have a hate speech law prohibiting hate speech in political campaigns. That core political speech can't even have it for trademark. This Supreme Court would not allow it, I think probably unanimously. But that doesn't mean that there can't be legal consequences for such hate speech. In Trump versus Hawaii, the Muslim ban case, the dissenters accepted the fact that Trump's rhetoric could be used to show animus there, establishment clause, but really anti-Muslim animus. And I think the majority, even the majority who rejected that under a very, very lenient standard for immigration, in the right case, I think that if someone, a political candidate became successful and elected and had been saying all sorts of really bigoted things, I think that could have legislation or an executive order or even legislation supported that candidate found unconstitutional in the right type of case as being discriminatory against the people he was defaming with his racist or anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim or homophobic rhetoric. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, so thank you. All excellent opening remarks. Jim, I want to begin with you. Thank you for laying the foundation regarding free speech doctrine in the United States context, as well as providing a comparative analysis with other state approaches around the world to issues such as hate speech and more government restrictions on content. In the past several months, particularly in response to mass shootings by individuals tied to white supremacist ideology, far-right extremist ideology, there have been some murmurings, calls for law reform. For example, a couple of months ago, there was an op-ed in the New York Times that asked, whether the First Amendment was killing us because of the robust protections that are afforded to individuals who are espousing such racist viewpoints and ideologies. More recently, I believe last month, there was an op-ed that ran in the Washington Post by a former high-level official with the Obama administration, and particularly the U.S. State Department, making a similar observation and calling specifically for reform to our laws surrounding free speech. And it's noteworthy that these calls were met with fierce backlash and characterized as attacks on free speech. And yet, I think it speaks to the increasing apprehension among segments of the American population regarding what I believe Ellie and Wajahat have characterized as the violent costs of free speech, particularly among historically marginalized groups, be they Latinos or African Americans or Muslims or Jews. And so I guess, to begin, you've spoken about free speech doctrine in abstract and sort of a theoretical sense. What is your response to these calls for law reforms? What is your response to the concerns that you're hearing expressed from your co-panelists, from Ellie, from Wajahat, that essentially, we all, every person on this panel makes their living based and due to the protections afforded from the First Amendment and particularly from free speech doctrine. None of us would be able to pursue our livelihoods without those protections. But by the same token, there is growing consensus among advocacy groups, among activists, among academics, that the Trump effect is real and has violent consequences, particularly among minority groups. And so what is your response to the calls for law reform? What is your response to concerns about physical safety and well-being of these minority communities?
I think that, first of all, with the present court, there's probably very little chance of having a hate speech exception. Now, should there be? That's a harder question. It's something I've thought a lot about and written about. And I think on balance, no, not in this country with our institutions. It's a very difficult topic. I can just try and summarize my views on that. The first reason would be, there's two reasons. One, how much good would it really do to allow hate speech to be punished? How much would the, if you could punish people for these odious statements, how much of this would really stop? And I think that the empirical evidence on that, there's never been a study that I've seen that shows that hate speech laws would make much of a difference. Maybe some. I mean, it's hard to say that it doesn't result in, hate speech doesn't result in some discrimination. On the other side, and maybe some violence, on the other side is, how do you craft that law reform? How do you change the rules that protect robust speech without opening up for suppression of speech that I would like, and we would all would like? We have to remember where this doctrine comes from. This comes from a correction of World War I cases in which anti-war protesters, 2,000 were prosecuted, and 1,000 served some very long sentences, 20 years. We just celebrated, I was involved in celebrating Justice Holmes' dissent in one of those cases after he changed his mind. And if you open up the incitement rule too much, you're right back to there. Future, what were these people sent to jail for? For encouraging people to resist the draft, which was a crime. For encouraging anti-war riots. So this doctrine that protects the bigots is developed because understanding how you need in a liberal democracy, people have to be able to criticize social conditions vehemently, passionately, and even argue against the laws and the status quo in a way. Now, where do you draw that line? We tried drawing it at like, well, if we think it's reasonably going to in the future sometimes cause some harm. Something I thought I heard Ellie say, it just doesn't work. Then we're going to punish people for wanting to oppose wars because it's interfering with the war effort. People are going to start going to jail if you loosen it up too much for threatening presidents like Trump, for the rhetoric against Trump. I think on balance we should leave it pretty much where it is. Maybe reform some of the incitement a little bit, but that's hard. I'll leave it at that.
No, that's excellent. So I actually want to just piggyback on that and focus on incitement a little bit more. We heard from Ellie and his suggestion that he believes that we need to move the standard on incitement. And you mentioned during your opening remarks, Jim, that the U.S. Supreme Court has in fact carved out exceptions to the free speech doctrine. These include defamation, obscenity, fraud, and significant to this discussion, imminent incitement to lawless action. We've also, heard and are aware of the fact that there's academic research that shows that there is in fact a statistically significant relationship between the political rhetoric coming from individuals like Donald J. Trump and the hate crimes against Jews and Blacks and Muslims and Latinos. We also know that at least in 1 of 5 of these hate crimes, that the word Trump or a reference to the Muslim ban or other discriminatory policy or Make America Great Again is in fact inscribed at the place of the criminal incident, right? So this could be the word Trump on a Black church after an arson. It can be the note that's stapled to an undocumented immigrant's stomach saying Trump does not like you. There are numerous, too many incidents where Trump is specifically referenced and sometimes by the perpetrators themselves as being the inspiration for the criminal lawless action. So is there an opportunity to challenge and signal that Americans want a change in terms of what we deem socially and politically acceptable from those in public office or aspiring to be, by perhaps filing a class action lawsuit? We're not challenging laws because there are no laws from the government in any state or from our federal government actually infringing upon First Amendment protections. Rather, what we have are various communities all making the same claim So is there an opportunity there to move the standard, as Ellie suggests, with respect to imminent lawless action, to hold these individuals accountable and send a clear message that in our pluralistic society, we respect peaceful coexistence and we demand it among various racial, ethnic, and religious groups?
It's a very good question. There are some cases, too, interesting in the lower courts. And let's put aside political figures. Maybe there should be something about, because it's got to be harmful when leaders, I mean, Trump is in some sense a symptom, but he's also a cause. But let's put that aside, and I'll tell you about two lawsuits that are pending that are pushing this change in the incitement. One is there's a Black Lives Matter case where a leader of Black Lives Matter said something, and somebody else at that rally injured a policeman, and now that Black Lives Matter a leader is being sued, and I think the lawsuit is going forward on some loosening up, I think, of the incitement standard. Then there's also one, I think, coming out of Charlottesville, where they're trying to sue some of the white supremacists there for inciting the violence. I believe it was against Tyre, but I'm not sure. But you see how this is going to cut both ways. If you loosen this up, that you're going to allow the people who are Jews will not replace us, and saying all these awful things and whipping up a crowd or saying something in the future, and you allow them to be sued in some kind of class action or some kind of personal injury suit. What about the Black Lives Matter person who is saying something like, take the street now, block that highway, let's do what we have to do? There's going to be costs to free speech, and then your side, is going to get caught up into this too. But maybe there can be some adjustment. But you have to realize where these. I heard someone say that these rules were made for white people to protect white people. I have to disagree with Ellie there. No, these laws were made to protect minorities, be they political minorities or during the civil rights era. The court did a lot with things like New York Times and Sullivan to protect minorities' rights in society too. So you got to be careful when you start monkeying with changing it around. And there could be some changes, but you got to be careful. It's not going to come out and bite the kind of rhetoric and advocacy you want to do to change society. Just keep that in mind. And I'm, try and just look at it both sides and not let my own views influence it, but to try and come up with some neutral principles that are going to allow the right balance of people being able to challenge the laws and policies to change, to get social change. But bear in mind, if you want to change it for the white supremacists, that the same laws can be used against Black Lives Matter.
Okay, great. So this actually, it's interesting. It reminds me of the debate we had a few weeks ago regarding domestic terrorism laws. There's no current law recognizing or criminalizing domestic terrorism per se, but the concern is that if we do create such a law to prosecute white supremacists or white nationalists that are committing acts of domestic terrorism, that it'll actually be misused against minority communities and further exacerbate their social and political repression and oppression. And so this speaks directly to a question that is posed by one of our audience members. So Ellie, I want to go to you. If we move the standard on incitement to violence, do we open up minority communities, African American community, the Jewish community, the Muslim community, to increased prosecution or oppression? Will these laws be used against them, such as in the Black Lives Matters case that Jim is highlighting for us?
Sure, of course they will. Whenever white people catch a cold, Black people catch the flu. I think it's unavoidable that anything that we do to make ourselves more able to catch and prosecute the white purveyors of hate speech, in the first instance, it will hurt Black and brown communities more. That's just how it works. I totally agree with Jim on that point. My point is the laws that we have are already disproportionately disadvantaging Black and brown communities. Jim is exactly right to bring up the DeRay lawsuit. That's the Black Lives Matter guy that Jim was talking about. He's absolutely right to bring that up. I view that case as the proof that even under our current very narrow hate speech laws, Black people are still in trouble. Black people are still in trouble for speaking out. Jim brought up the Times v. Sullivan, right? That was protected the New York Times. That's why they did that, right? Like the African Americans who speak out, minorities who speak out, gay people who speak out are always under more scrutiny and trouble and problems from the legal system, even as it is today. I'm trying to expand the law to catch some white people too, right? Because we're already under threat. We're already under stress. We're already in danger of running afoul of the prevailing white society. So again, I am not saying Jim is wrong. I am saying Jim is right, and I don't care, because I am so focused on trying to stop some of this other white-led hate speech. I accept as gospel that if we change the laws in the way that I am advocating for, and Bill Barr is still the Attorney General when that change happens, the first pure person to get prosecuted under my new standard will be AOC or Rashida Tlaib or some other woman of color, right? Like that's just how it works, and I get that, and that is horrible. But if we can find a way to start to get at the white purveyors of hate speech, that is basically a trade I am willing to make. We were talking earlier about Brandenburg v. Ohio, right? We were talking earlier about the World War I overreaction, over narrowing of speech that produced our current free speech doctrine, right? Just for viewers to remember, as Jim pointed out, none of this was happening at the founding, right? We are not living under the free speech doctrine as envisioned by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was long dead and gone by the time these laws were made, okay? So A. But B, Brandenburg v. Ohio is a case protecting the Klan. Like, that's how that standard got written. And all I want is to have a free speech standard written in a time where Black and brown people are allowed to have a voice, because that's what we don't have. When I say that it was written by white people for white people, I mean literally these doctrines were written in a time where only white people were allowed to have an influence on the law. The World War I laws came at a time when Jewish people weren't even allowed on the court. All right, the Brandenburg v. Ohio came during a time when there were no Black people allowed into the judiciary. There were no Latinos allowed in the judiciary, where you couldn't be openly gay and be a judge. Like, that's when our current doctrine is written. And I don't think it's too much to ask that we rewrite our doctrines with input from minorities and from non-white people. And if all that means is that we move the standard a little bit differently, and I accept, again, that the majority culture will use those laws against us. I understand how that works. But if we simply allow some more input from non-white citizens, so that we can get to a point where perhaps some of the white purveyors of hate and destruction can also be caught, like I said earlier, that ultimately it's the Faustian bargain, but it's ultimately the horrible trade I'm willing to make.
So thank you for that, Ellie. Wajahat, I want to build on Ellie's comments and move on to you. There is a perception among some in minority communities that the free speech doctrine has been reduced or manipulated as a tool to further subjugate and oppress minorities, historically marginalized communities. So specifically, for example, there's been a number of high-profile cases in the past few years, perhaps foremost Colin Kaepernick. right? An individual, a member of, a person of color who attempts to exercise free expression, to express his opposition, his objection to police brutality, and suffers economically violent consequences because of it, notwithstanding American constitutional values, right? We know that, the First Amendment guards us, protects us from the government, not private actors such as the NFL. And yet we still pride ourselves as Americans as having these enshrined values that derive from the Constitution, that protect free speech and free expression. And Colin Kaepernick is really just one of many high-profile incidents from the past several years. We saw Reza Aslan, lost his show on CNN because of some off-color tweet he made about Trump, and so his show, Believer, was canceled. We see the same repercussions against people of color in the political sphere in a number of different contexts. And so as a result, there is this perception among people of color, among historically marginalized community, that it's free speech for some, but not for all. And specifically when anyone, any person of color, anyone from a historically marginalized community actually says or does something that challenges the status quo, that challenges or makes the establishment feel uncomfortable, that they suffer very deep, severe consequences as a result of that. What is your response to that?
Yeah, so some people might not like this answer, but this is the way to really understand it. We are witnessing again the death rattle of white supremacy, which has transformed into a death march both here and across the globe. And that's the framing from which to really understand how a lot of these laws were written by white people for white people, sometimes with the best of intentions, and the existing double standards that exist in the applications of the laws, in arrests, in sentencing, in media coverage, in rhetoric. I'll give you one example. Economic anxiety. There you go. It's 2019, and to this day, as a person of color who covered the election, many people of color who are journalists and writers and reporters said, guys, it's not economic anxiety. We're telling you it's culture, it's racial anxiety. And they said, nope, it's economic anxiety, the hillbilly elegy, the Rust Belt. And now, fast forward, 2019, every single sober study that has been done by academics says the primary motivation for a lot of Trump's voters, not the exclusive motivation, the primary motivation was what? Racial anxiety. Now you get to 2019, and you listed the litany of sins that Trump has committed, the racism. We still don't say racism. What do we say? Racial hiccup, racial flare, racial trip up. Meanwhile, the rest of us are saying, for the love of God, just call it what it is. It's racism, the double standard that exists. Now we see the both sidesism, right? And this is what I warn about is from a media landscape and from a framing landscape, how does a democracy survive when one of the political parties is mainstreaming and promoting white supremacist conspiracy theories and is hijacked by an extremist ideology, and we decide to both sides it and give them an equal platform? And what we've seen with free speech and with the kind of social contract that we have to give both sides argument is when you actually advance both sides. I'll give you one example: climate change. Climate change denialism versus climate change acceptance, right? 99% of people believe in climate change. You have like two cranks. When you both sides it actually hurts truth and promotes climate change denialism because people say, oh, this is a legitimate platform. Let me go Google and research climate change denialism. Same thing happens with vaccination. You have pro-vaccination, anti-vaxxers. Fast forward now in 2019, and the World Health Organization says that vaccine hesitancy is a top 10 global threat, and we have made measles great again. Okay, so I'm just giving you an example of how some of the best intentions of both sides and everything works against the marginalized communities. Colin Kaepernick, a great example. He goes, listen, man, you guys said exercise First Amendment free speech. And it's precisely those actors who are apparently the First Amendment warriors, the free speech warriors, who are saying, whoa, not on the football field, darky. Whoa, darky, just throw the football. Don't nonviolently protest the fact that black bodies are being killed. Which then becomes, then the question then becomes, well, what do you want me to do? If I'm exercising my First Amendment right in a nonviolent fashion that you have told me, if I'm following the footsteps of free speech warriors, even that is not good enough for you, so that the only recourse means die quietly. suffer quietly. And so the tension that both Jim and Eli have brought out is exactly the tension that we're facing, because historically, this has always been used against communities of color. This has always given teeth, if you will, or ammunition to law enforcement to go against Black people in particular, or those deemed radical by the government. And specifically, you made a good point, NG, when it comes to domestic terrorism. There's no federal law on the books. So the reason why there's so much coverage on the war on terror when it comes to Muslims is because we have material support against terrorism as a crime. That leads to foreign groups. Who are the foreign groups? ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And the report shows that even though Georgia State University did this report last year, even though the #1 domestic terror threat in America are white supremacist terrorism, when there is a Muslim suspect, there's 4 to 7 times as much media coverage. 7 times as longer when it comes to the criminal sentencing. The double standards. And so people say, a lot of civil liberties groups, a lot of people of color say, no, just don't give law enforcement more teeth with a domestic terrorism bill because they will go against more people of color. But then you say, the #1 domestic terror threat is white supremacists. They're going to kill us anyway. Like, we got to have some teeth. So this is the bridge that we have to kind of cross, because no matter what we do due to white supremacy, we're effed. We have to challenge it, chip away at it. And it's not just going to be the law, but it's going to be also the media, education, culture, more and more white people doing the labor that we've been doing, trying to convince people, hey, we do not have to suffer for you to feel great again, right? That's going to be a process, a cultural process, education process, political process. But then if the First Amendment is killing us anyway, which it is, then can we not articulate or define or move the needle to then go against those harmful actors who are deliberately using it to promote hate? And the final thing I'll say on this is when I do a callback to my report, Fear Incorporated, all of those actors after 9/11 were able to launder their hate under the guise of national security. We're just national security experts. We're worried about national security, war on terrorism, domestic terrorism. We're the Paul Reveres. We're the individuals who are warning you. We're the Luca Brasis of our community, willing to do the dirty work and call out the people that no one else is. That's why they got funded. Once that ship had sailed, guess what? All those national security experts, guess how they rebranded themselves in the past 3 or 4 years, NG? Free speech warriors. First Amendment crusaders. For the sake of the First Amendment and free speech, we're willing to say what's unpopular and politically incorrect, which was, lo and behold, one of the selling points of Trump. Keep it real. We're mad as hell. I shoot from the hip. If President Obama did what Trump did, ... that should be like a novel. But Trump gets away with it. And it goes back to the white supremacy narrative. I know people hate hearing that. I know people hate hearing the words white privilege. But one of the benefits of privilege is being ignorant to that privilege and not realizing the blind spots that exist within the law, made with the best of intentions that affect the rest of our communities. And so that's how we move forward. I just wanted to tease that out and give context. I know it's messy, but this is all messy. People want clean-cut answers, but we have to talk about the holistic range of stuff. And final thing I'll say is social media. People say, oh, social media, First Amendment speech, watch, why are you for deplatforming people? Because now it'll be used against people of color. When you deplatform Alex Jones, finally, guess what happened to Alex Jones? He becomes marginal. When you deplatform Milo Yiannopoulos, guess what happens? He becomes marginal. When Twitter and Facebook actually implement their terms and conditions, you know who would be deplatformed? Donald Trump. And our national security would be in a I could sleep easier. So, and finally, one thing I'll say is when it comes to Eli's point, I promise I'll stop after this. At the front end, I'm from the Bay Area. I could tell you these tech giants were run and created by white men. There were not women there in the room. There were not people of color in the room. If there were women and people of color in the room when this technology was created, they would have said, hey, guys, what about X, Y, and Z? And the #1 victims of hate and bullying on social media platforms are women. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Thank you. I actually do want to turn to the issue of social media. First, I want to move on to Jim. Jim, what I actually wanted to speak to, though, we're starting to run out of time. We still have a few more substantive subjects that I want to touch upon before we do end the webinar. So it looks like we'll be running over time as expected. But I want to speak about counter speech. Many First Amendment warriors will respond. Free speech absolutists will respond that the appropriate response to this sort of vitriolic, inflammatory political rhetoric is more speech, not censorship, but more speech. And the counter speech doctrine was developed in a different era. And we currently find ourselves, again, based on this conversation we're having, we find ourselves in a context where you have socially, politically, economically marginalized groups that are being targeted by very powerful individuals, some multimillionaires. And the question is it realistic to expect that, a mother of 3 kids who holds down 2 jobs and is financially strapped, trying to make ends meet, trying to simply survive, is in any kind of privileged position to engage meaningfully with the individuals who are helping manifest discrimination in her life and in her children's life on a daily basis?
Yeah, I'll answer, well, try and answer. It's a very good question, but I wanted to first talk about the social media a bit. And agree that it is particularly gendered in terms of women being chased off by the harassment. And I think there's a lot that can be done about that, both the social media platforms themselves, that does not violate the First Amendment. They're private actors. They should do things. And I've written, taking issue with my friend Eugene Volokh, that I think there's more that even government could do to punish certain types of doxing and very vexatious behavior online. The cyber mob, I think there is there can be both criminal and civil. There's room under free speech doctrine for both civil and criminal punishment for some of that cyber speech. Now, to your question about the counter speech, which, as you said, came from Justice Brandeis's brilliant concurrence in Whitney. It's hard to say. Look, some of the harms of hate speech are dignitary and just the psychic damage it does. I remember going online with my daughter for a Sunday school thing and looking up, say, about Jews. There was a time when you type in Jew in Google, you would get this horrible anti-Semitic speech that I was reading that really hurts, the lies, the misrepresentations. Counter speech, is it going to really help that kind of wound? I don't think so. On the other hand, where it does help, it doesn't allow the poor mother of 3 to fight against the billionaire now. But when you do see it, it's very effective, the counter speech. On campus, if there's a racist incident on campus, a racist speech on campus, like with Oklahoma City one with that horrible those frat boys and what they're chanting about, the people come out on campus in mass when there's and in Phoenix there was somebody at a mosque, some idiots were at a mosque and were on their phones and were broadcasting some anti-Islamic stuff. In the faith communities, the Christian and Jewish communities come out in mass, and along with Muslims, to protest that. That's where the counter speech really does work, where people of goodwill, who are the majority still in America, because I do agree that there's sort of a death rattle of white supremacists. It's always been there. When the good people come out and react to this kind of speech, that's where the counter speech is working.
Thank you. So I want to move on to social media. But first, I do want to give you an opportunity to respond to, and provide your insights regarding the counter speech doctrine, if you'd like. But also just moving on to social media, as we round out the webinar, research suggests that racist speech on Facebook, on Twitter, eventually translates into violent actions in the real world. Again, primarily targeting members of a community of color. What kind of policies do we need on social media, whether it's with respect to ads that play on racial and ethnic and religious hatred and division and fears, or with respect to inappropriate, or inappropriate is a too abstract of a term, but maybe calls for violence, such as calling for lawmakers to be hung or to be harmed on Twitter, or references to General Pershing and killing Muslims with bullets laced with pig's blood. What kind of policies do we need across the board with respect to speech on social media and Twitter? That is, this is not the government. These are private, privately run corporations, with business interests. But so they're not governed. They may, they may be subject to constitutional values, but they're not governed by the same legal principles. So what would you like to say?
So first of all, I want to respond to the marketplace, the counter speech, right? Arguments. Professor Tim Wu has a really good article from the Knight Institute about how we need to re-understand our First Amendment problem, not as a scarcity of speech, and thus worry about government controls stopping speech and pushing it down, but as a scarcity of listener attention. And that the government's role, under the current government at least, of drowning out other people's speech is in fact the kind of speech problem that the founders at least would have recognized as an issue. Let's go back to World War I for a second. Those anti-war protests that sparked kind of some horrible speech laws, those were in response to the government, the US government's actual ministry of propaganda that it set up to promote World War I, right? There's nothing that Nazi Germany invented, all right? They got a lot of ideas from us, and they got a lot of ideas from what we were doing in the teens and 20s. And one of the things that we were doing was pumping out state-sponsored propaganda. So one way of like retconning and re-understanding our speech laws is to maybe think about whether or not the First Amendment, which is supposed to respect everybody's right to speech, actually has a role to play in tamping down government propaganda that drowns out everybody else's speech. Like it's a law review article, so it's a little in the theoretical clouds, but it's an interesting way to kind of think through this problem of where we are and what we're actually seeing in society. It's not that people don't have access to speech, it's that people don't have access to random people's attention. So that's number one. And that to me leans right into where we are with social media, right? Which is the sparky attention grabbing thing that we're all looking at, and that we're all the milieu which all of this is being dissolved in is Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever, right? And as you say, Angie, absolutely, they're private companies. If they could decide today to stop white supremacy on their platforms, and they could do it. The reason why, and they have said this, @Jack has said this, if the reason why they do not do that is because doing the things that it would take to stop white supremacy in the same way that they did the things that it took to stop like ISIS recruitment and whatever on Twitter would catch too many Republicans. There are too many elected Republican officials that traverse in this crap that Twitter feels that if it did the things that it would need to do, there are too many congressmen and senators, to say nothing of the President of the United States, that would also have to be banned. So they have literally said they have a lower standard for white supremacy and white domestic terrorism than they do for international terrorism because Republicans don't track in those waters. It's disgusting. So how can it be stopped? Well, A, again, they're private companies. If they got a clue, they could do what they want. B, they are in a marketplace. If you could make, your competing social media platform, I know that's the Republicans' like Valhalla solution, just start your own company and somehow magically things get better. My solution, you start regulating these social media companies as public utilities, right? So in the same way that electric company, which is a public utility, but not a government organization. In the same way that the electric company cannot deny me service because I'm Black, right? They can't refuse to wire my house because of the color of my skin. If you start regulating social media companies as public utilities, you can start to think about how to unwrap some of the racism and sexism and bigotry that is inherent in those platforms. it's a lot of work, and I don't, and it is fraught with danger. I think all of us would agree that almost the last thing we want is @Jack deciding who gets to have a voice and who doesn't. Like, that's not great. The last thing you want is Mark Zuckerberg actually being in charge of who gets to say what. That would be wrong. So it's a lot to unpack. The last thing I'll say about that, though, is we as lawyers, we love the bright line. It's one of the brightest line distinctions we have in our laws, right? The difference between government stamping on speech and private citizens stamping on speech, right? We really like the fact that our speech laws are about the government actions and not about private citizen actions. Most private citizens easily don't understand the two, but lawyers, it's like we learned it like day one of law school. We're like, yeah, we got something now. Let's not forget that these companies take their cues from the government and from what is socially and politically allowable. So if you, again, I'll go back to incitement. If you start saying that incitement is wrong and you move the timeline back a little bit, that is a cue that Twitter will take. That is a cue that Zuckerberg will take. If you start, and it would take one lawsuit where one of these crazy mass shooter people was sued by a victim, and the victim sued not only the mass shooter, not only the gun company, but also Facebook for promoting their rhetoric. It would take one successful lawsuit of that nature to completely change the business calculus for Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and Snapchat and whatever the hell's coming next, TikTok, that I don't even know because I'm too old. All right, like that is how you do it. You either you make them liable for something, and you can't do that until you start regulating them as a public utility. But you do that once, and their whole game changes right quick.
Good. So we need to litigate. That's what you're telling us. I want to go back to something you said earlier. Something you said earlier, though, regarding the access to listeners' attention. And so along those lines, do news media outlets have a role to play in ensuring that members of historically marginalized groups have access to the marketplace of ideas, have access to actually counter this noxious speech that directly impacts their lived experiences on a daily basis?
I mean, you gotta trust the people to vote with their feet on that. Again, like, I think one of the interesting things about Tim Wu's argument is that it makes it interesting to think about how you might go about stopping state propaganda, which is also known as Fox News in this country. Like that's an interesting way to get at that particular kind of nugget of a problem. But I think in a more broad sense, we've been successful kind of as a nation with just having lots of newspapers. I mean, one of the things that I feel like people don't understand, and they feel like I'm saying this just because I'm self-aggrandizing myself as a member of the media, but like in its initial inception, the most important part of the First Amendment from the perspective of the founders was the protection of the media, was the protection of the news. These guys were not sitting in the middle of Times Square, not that there was a Times Square, Herald Square, I'm just shouting things out to the Native Americans about like what they thought about the British. These people were writers. These people were publishing books and pamphlets and whatever. And that is what fundamentally the First Amendment is trying to protect. If we go back to a sense where the people that we really need to protect are journalists and journalism, and we can debate forever what that actually means. I think we get around some of the more difficult issues about scaling back free speech protections, as long as we are kind of living in a New York Times v. Sullivan world where like the protections of the press are kind of sacrosanct, right? You can kind of deal with Fox if you have CNN and MSNBC. You can't deal with InfoWars if that is being promoted and retweeted and amplified by the government of the United States to propagandize and proselytize and ruin the citizenry thinking and dominating their attention, right? So like I try to draw a distinction there, but as Waj says, as Jim says, It's all messy. None of this is easy. None of this is gonna. There's no magic bullet, right? There's no bullet dipped in pig's blood that's gonna stop all of this, right? It takes lots and lots and lots of small tweaks here and slight tweaks there and retconning there to try to live in a world, in a pluralistic society where alt-right hate mongers have some pause before they get into the marketplace of ideas and promote violence.
Excellent. Thank you, Ellie. Rajat, I want to give you an opportunity to answer the same set of questions that I posed to Ellie regarding counter speech, as well as what is your sort of dream, ideal response to what is currently happening on Facebook and Twitter?
Yeah, so the marketplace of ideas, like counter speech would be great if the marketplace was truly free. What happens if it's rigged and a lot of people don't have entry or don't have the power? Number one. Number two, I actually worked with Facebook and social media companies a couple of years ago in a different capacity, and I could tell you, working with them closely. Specifically, I went to several countries. We went to Philippines, we went to India, we went to the Bay Area, we went to Indonesia, and we worked with people on the ground to come up with solutions that they would come up with to combat the challenges that they're facing. My job was to recruit these people, work with them, get the talent in the room, and do a kind of like a hackathon for 3 days. These people identified the problems, they identified the solutions, and we helped them. The problem that whether it was in Philippines or Indonesia or the Bay Area, repeatedly the problem was hate, discrimination. The minority of that community was being used and abused and assaulted by, or through rather, the social media tools. Same problem. They're the ones who came up with the problem. We just helped them come up with the solutions. I can tell you that Facebook at that time was less concerned with some of these brilliant solutions that they came with. They were really concerned with how it looked. So as long as they got their press release and the press came, and as long as the local government was happy, they were happy. Facebook can do a lot more. Mark Zuckerberg was just revealed, had dinner with Donald Trump, along with Peter Thiel, a billionaire Republican, a man who used his power and clout to take out Gawker from the marketplace of ideas because he's angry at them because they apparently outed him, right? And he's the one who funded Hulk Hogan's lawsuit against them. Yay for lawsuits. So I'm having worked closely with these companies, and companies, aren't evil. People there are trying to do good, but at the same time, this particular company, Facebook and Twitter, which is, by the way, also allowing, under the guise of free speech, political campaigns that are lying, all right? Which is going to help disinformation, which is going to hurt democracy, in addition to privacy leaks, in addition to God knows what they're doing with their data. But one of the primary ways that all the hate groups that we have talked about have been able to mainstream and globalize their message, social media. Just connect the dots, it's all there. And so I believe that first and foremost, if you are a Twitter or a Facebook and you have some terms and conditions, and I don't care who is violating those terms and conditions, enforce it uniformly and consistently. If that was to happen on Twitter, Donald Trump would lose his Twitter account today. A good point is that the reason why they don't is because so much, unfortunately, of the other side, of the Republicans, is now mired in this hateful swamp. Take it back 10 years, Daryl Johnson of the Department of Homeland Security wrote a paper on the rise of the right-wing radicalization of the right wing, and that report was killed by Republicans and conservatives because they said it would hurt them and it would hurt many of the people in the conservative movement. And voila, Daryl Johnson was like, dude, I'm warning you about the rise of white nationalism, but it was quietly killed within the DHS, and he wrote a book about it. I recommend people writing that book. So this is very real. And so what do we do? Again, come to this question, and I want you guys to answer it as the audience. If we do both sides approach to society, where one of the sides is mainstreaming hate, what do we do? And this is why I think it's come to a point right now where who would have thought that Mark Zuckerberg would become one of the 21st century villains? Who would have thought when watching Social Network, that great movie directed by David Fincher with the Reznor soundtrack, that he would emerge as one of the great villains? And this is what we need now is a cost to these companies, because they are a private for-profit company. They're not in it for the social good. They're not. It's not in their business model. And no matter how much Zuckerberg says, oh, we're not journalists, guess what? You kind of do journalism. Most people get their news now across the world from Facebook feeds. And if you don't deplatform, there's a cost to that hate. That cost is borne on us. So I'm for the breaking up of these companies. I'm for the regulation of these companies. I'm for private actors pressuring these companies. I'm for a political cost to these companies trafficking in white supremacy and profiting off of white supremacy. And I believe in the absence of this spotlight, this really intense spotlight on Twitter and Facebook in particular. And by the way, don't forget, Facebook also owns WhatsApp and also owns Instagram. And also don't forget that Sri Lanka had to suspend WhatsApp and Facebook because of the racial riots that were being engineered against Muslims. And I was thinking about writing an op-ed saying that Facebook is killing Muslims around the world. Look at Myanmar, look at Sri Lanka, look at India. Social media, disinformation, conspiracy theory, hate, it spreads like that, like wildfire. It always affects the most marginalized communities in that country. In America, it happens to be Black people, LGBTQ, Latinos, and Muslims. So I'm for a full frontal assault on these social media companies, because in the absence of this assault or this regulation or this scrutiny, call it what you will, there will be a cost to not only minority communities, but also to the truth and also to democracy. And we have left them unchecked for far too long. We have adulated them as our saviors, the titans of tech who will come and save us. Well, instead of a utopia, they're creating a dystopia. And another problem is, and this is just another thing I want to throw out there, is notice that we as a society come up with technology, a tool, a toy, unleash it, and then afterwards go, oh crap, we should have thought about how it could be abused. And now we're dealing with the consequences. Social media is a tool. It depends on how it is used. It can be used both for good and for bad. So I don't want to just knock on social media in general. We've also seen the rise of Black Lives Matter, for example, through social media, right? We've also seen the rise of journalists of color through social media. But this is going to be really fundamental moving forward in the 21st century, as so much of the world is relying upon social media for representation, for information, for journalism, for data. If we don't combat this, and if we don't exercise some restraints, it's going to get worse. So that's my moment of urgency, my clarion call. You got to do something.
Good. So I'm hearing somewhat of a consensus that there needs to be costs, and that perhaps litigation is one way of seeing those costs happen. So as we wind down the webinar, I do want to give each of you a few moments to share your concluding insights and observations with our audience. So Jim, let's start with you. What are some of your concluding remarks before we go?
Well, I would say that I'm not an expert on social media, but I think a full frontal assault on them is probably not the way to go. I mean, you see Trump trying to do that too. But there could be, I do think there's room, a lot of room for more work for them to do themselves. Now, we made this distinction about they're a private company, and then if they impose restrictions on the platform, that doesn't violate the First Amendment. But lawsuits are considered state action that would trigger First Amendment concerns. So would frontal assaults in terms of making them like public utilities. That would raise First Amendment issues. And just a minor, well, I don't think it's minor, but it was one small point about New York Times and Sullivan. Yes, they were a media company that was being protected. But what was being protected there was a protest against the way the civil rights workers, particularly Martin Luther King, was being treated, and a large judgment, not just against the New York Times, but the individual ministers and people who placed that ad. And one of the things that why the civil rights movement succeeded was when the nation saw what was going on with the police dogs and the hoses and free media that was freed up by cases like New York Times and Sullivan, allowed that social change to happen. Again, you see who's screaming about New York Times and Sullivan on the other end? It's Trump, it's Justice Thomas, it's the conservatives. They know the power they know the power of free speech for progressive social movements. So I'd be real careful on frontal assaults on any media. Not to deny that there's not a real problem, huge problem with this death rattle of white supremacists. I just don't know that frontal assaults. I do know that frontal assaults on free speech are not the way. Some minor adjustments maybe, but there's something does need to be done about the white supremacists and that violence. And as I say, I've always supported hate crime laws as opposed to hate speech laws.
Thank you, Jim. Wajahat, let's go to you. Concluding remarks before we wrap up?
Sure. So when I say frontal assault, I mean if we don't confront the death march of white supremacy, the rest of us are going to die. And the death march of white supremacy turns into authoritarianism. And for those who don't think you have skin in the game, you know, it's the immigrants, it's the blacks, it's the Latinos, it's the Muslims, it's the women. Look at Trump, for example. It's also Republicans. It's also law enforcement. And so when I say full frontal assault, I say it with the figurative language, of course, but I say we use the tools at our disposal. That's what I'm saying. The tools at our disposal to really confront what we are witnessing in the society, and it's going to get worse because after Trump goes, Trumpism is going to last, and all it needs is a better, more polished, less reckless vehicle to be the messenger. These ideas are already mainstreamed, and so when I said that analogy about the Avengers, that's exactly it. We need lawyers, we need people who are journalists, we need educators, we need citizens, and I'll end it on this way because everyone thinks, oh man, I'm not on TV like you, I'm not on a webinar. You know, I'm not a professor and so forth. What can I do? I think each person has a responsibility in their specific sphere or with their superpower, whether it's their vocation or their community or their church or their mosque or even their family, to at least do something. And I'll give you an example. We as a society have kind of these rules. We're all subjective actors, despite all of our protests for being objective. As we wait for laws in society to catch up, right? Because everything's going to move very slowly because as we've all agreed with, it's messy. It's going to be messy. I'll give you an example of how we make a choice as a society. KKK has a First Amendment right to exist, to say what they want to say, to protest. But we as a society, back in the day, maybe pre-2018, said, yeah, KKK, you can survive and thrive here if you want, but we're not going to give you a platform. You're not going to get a microphone. We're not going to invite you and give you both sides. If we do invite you, we're going to use our privilege, our authority, our space to actually challenge you and explain to people why you're hateful and don't represent our values. I now have teachers coming up to me and saying, what do I do? How do I teach history when some of my students challenge the fundamental facts, or some of my students are pro-Confederacy? How am I supposed to both sides this? This was a fear that was initiated in 2016 by certain teachers. Like, what do we do? And now it's 2019, and that fear is realized. And you realize that you cannot be neutral on this. To use that phrase, you can't be neutral on this train. You just can't anymore. And so we have to make a decision as subjective actors. How will we confront hate? Will we enable it through our silence? Will we enable it through this fake both sides false equivalence? This is nonsense. Will we enable it and be complicit just because we're afraid? Or will we interject using the powers that we have to try to shift the society towards justice and equality? And that's what I want to leave you guys with, is we all have certain superpowers. You can't stay neutral anymore. You just can't. And this both sides false equivalence is going to kill the rest of us. And I know you might not care about it, but think about what happens in authoritarianism. And what does authoritarians do? They always attack truth first. Always. They always attack the institutions of truth. And then they always say, we are the truth and only we can be believed. And what happens when the First Amendment is used as a sword against the rest of us? That's the question that we tried to answer today. It's going to be messy, but I do believe there's a way forward, and there's no real right answers, but we need change agents to do the right thing, and each person has to step up and do the right thing.
Thank you, Wajahat. Ali, last words?
Reject absolutism. The solution to our current problems, our speech problems in particular, lies in nuance, lies in incrementalism, lies in rethinking, lies in reimagination, lies in creativity. It does not lie in the easy answer of absolutism. the thing that we have seen most from the current free speech absolutists is this belief, false belief, that the First Amendment is something that came down from Moses off the mountain, has always been with us, and can never be violated. That is simply not true. That is not true of our history. That is not true of our doctrine. That is not how we have gotten to this point. So that's why I believe, especially lawyers with a real understanding and deep respect for the nuance of this very difficult issue. And if you as lawyers can be ambassadors for that nuance when you are dealing with people who don't have your training and who frankly don't know what the hell they're talking about, then you can also help us move forward in a rational way.
Thank
Here's
you.
the messiness.
So on behalf of the American Bar Association, I want to thank each of you, Ali, Wajahat, and Jim, for joining us and sharing your expertise and your insights and observations with all of us today. It's been an enlightening conversation, and I want to thank each of our members of our audience for joining us as well. Without you, these webinars would not be possible. Please make sure that you join us for our next webinar next month that explores immigration-related decisions at the U.S. Supreme Court. For those of you observing the holidays, have a wonderful, joyous holiday season, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.